Good evening. Let me just quickly introduce the event, and then I'll turn it over to Alan Brinkley to introduce Professor Naeem. This is, of course, a great event in the academic year, and to have some of our most distinguished faculty working on some of the most interesting projects and research come and speak to the community is the essence of what we do, and a great privilege and pleasure for all of us. Shahid is a wonderful person to listen to under any circumstances. I am sure that tonight it will be extremely so. He is sort of at the core of what we all think of as important subjects of globalization. So biodiversity and death of species and life of species and ecology of the natural environment, and how that interacts with and intersects with the human and other parts of the environment. It's always just staggering to hear these statistics about loss of species and the effects of that. Also staggering to hear statistics about the degrees to which we're interconnected. And I think we can expect some of that, but in the brief conversation that we had before the lecture, I think we're in for a special treat, because he's going to take this to almost everything that's in the news today, and we look forward to it greatly. So, Alan, Provost, Alan.
Well, I want to welcome all of you here, and it's really my pleasure this evening to introduce Shahid Naeem as tonight's university lecturer. Shahid, of course, is the professor in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Environmental Biology. University lectures are created in 1971, to give distinguished faculty an opportunity to address a broad university audience. And as Lee has said, Shahid is a very appropriate person to provide such a lecture, since he is an outstanding example of a serious scientist who communicates effectively to large audiences, such as the large and unseated audience we have here today. Shahid came to Columbia in 2003 and joined a department that was and still is one of the university's smallest, but one could also say that it is among our most important departments because of the great urgency of its mission. DE3B, as the department is known, is one of Columbia's newest departments as well, and it's a product of the changing character of what was once scientific anthropology at Columbia, and of the indefatigable efforts of Don Melnick to build a new department dedicated to ecology and environmental biology, which would bring together environmental biologists at Columbia with scientists from other institutions in the New York area through the Center for Environmental Research and Conservation, known as CERC. Shahid's arrival 5 years ago was a critical moment in the growth of DE3B, not only because of his own leadership as chair of the department over the last several years and as head of an important laboratory, and not only because of his incredible energy and commitment, but also because of the great significance of his work. Shahid describes his mission in a powerful statement that sounds a little like Lenin, actually, that accompanies his description of his research. Our group studies the ecological consequences of declining biodiversity by whatever means possible. We believe that changes in biodiversity, either through local extinction of biological invasions, is the single most important and dramatic problem in contemporary ecology. Shahid's research has helped strengthen our understanding of the relationship between biodiversity and the future ecology of the planet. His work, recently published in a book that he has co-edited, Biodiversity and Ecosystem Functioning, argues that human domination of ecosystems is leading not just to a loss of biodiversity, but is posing a danger to the stability of ecosystems broadly throughout the planet. Columbia is renowned for its broad commitment to environmental and ecological scholarship through the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, the Department of Earth and Environmental Science, the Earth Institute, the School of International and Public Affairs, the School of Public Health, and many other parts of the university. But among the most important elements of this great project is, of course, the department that Shahid leads, and he has brought to this vast project a combination of scientific rigor in pursuing his own important research, and also a calm but urgent advocacy of the importance of continued progress in our understanding of one of the greatest challenges of our time. So please join me in welcoming Shahid Naeem, who will deliver a lecture entitled Nature, Knowledge, and Our National Identity, Notes from an Increasingly Lonely Planet. Shahid?
Well, thank you, everyone. That's a lot to live up to. I'm not sure how to proceed. In fact, when I was told I was going to have the opportunity to do the university lecture, like most people when they're told such awards are coming their way, the first reaction is one of great sort of pride and joy. And then the next reaction is, oh my gosh, what am I going to say? And so I've been dwelling on that for several months. And I actually got the idea of what to talk about after I returned from a summer of travel in China, Kenya, Mali, Tanzania, trying to see how we would take the science of ecology and actually to put it to one of the toughest problems we face, which is poverty alleviation. It was quite a challenge, I have to say. And I returned back exhausted from that summer of travel, and had to return for an important administrative event which got canceled, and then had to be there to introduce and welcome the new students to our department, the department that I chair. I gave the welcoming lecture to the class of 2012, and then I had to teach introductory biology, horrible things like the Krebs cycle and protein synthesis and so forth. And so by the time September 5th came around, I was really ready for something different. And I got this email from an old friend of mine, and it reminds me of, in Marcel Proust's The Remembrance of Things Past, you know, he has the Madeleine, he dips it in the tea, and it unleashes a large sort of set of sensations that he then tracks back to memories of his past. And if you haven't read that, then you've probably seen the movie Ratatouille, where Anton Ego, the restaurant critic, has the ratatouille, and it brings back floods of his childhood in France. And this was what gave me the idea of how to fill in this title. So you see, our department was named Ecology, Evolution, and Environmental Biology, which allowed us to adapt to whatever would come our way. And so when I had to supply the title, I thought this would allow me to adapt to whatever comes my way. Of course, then you have to live up to the expectations of such a large title. And I knew that I had it there, but it was actually this email that was sent to me. And it was from an old friend, and it was this attachment to the New York Times obituary for Robert Giroux, who's a man I never actually met. But he is someone who was very influential in my thinking about the world and about biodiversity as well, believe it or not. Now, this was back in the 1970s when I was really at the place where I'd be interacting with Robert Giroux, because he was one of the lead editors in a firm called Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. I used to love answering the phone. Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, what can we do for you? And I was just out of high school, and I was in an inventory control, which was the department that I was in. My job was to balance the supply of books with the demand, which was always really difficult when you had people do silly things like win awards, because suddenly you'd be caught short. In my opinion, as a youngster, I felt that this publishing firm was a very sleepy place, and the editors had eclectic tastes. And the 70s was a great period of transition. In 1970, the Nobel Prize was won by Alexander Solzhenitsyn in his writing about the Gulag Archipelago, for example, and in what was going on in Russia, the former Soviet Union. And Norman Borlaug got the Nobel Prize as well for helping to start the Green Revolution. He was supposed to be one of the people who helped lead to practically a doubling of food production in our world. And he actually was criticized by many people for doing things which were not so good for our environment and not so good for the farmers and many, many people. And he was steadfastly a strong believer that he had done the right thing, so much so he created the World Food Prize, which is given out to people who help to push the Green Revolution forward. So just to give you a sense of what the 70s was like, all you youngsters in the room, in 1970, this is just 1970, the Beatles made their last studio recording, which was Let It Be. Janis Joplin had died. The Supremes gave their farewell concert. The Chicago Seven were acquitted of charges of inciting a riot at the Democratic National Convention. We had the first Earth Day. We had 4 students shot at Kent State, Ohio, and 2 students at Jackson State for protests against the Vietnam War, which we were in the thick of. We had the first New York Marathon. Women marched down Fifth Avenue for equality. And the world population, I remember that, the world population had reached 3.7 billion. And I remember it as a youngster with my first job as an inventory controller that we were also in a recession. So in case you can't see the dates down there, that's actually 1972 up to 1982. So in the so the time period I'd be looking at is right around here, and you see it's so sort of quaint, isn't it, right now, to be looking at an index that goes from 200 to less than 1,000, and then we think, oh my God, we're plummeting into a recession. But you can see there was a sort of steady growth, and all of a sudden, due to a weak economy and a number of other factors, the investment in the things in the United States for the trying to improve our well-being, the Vietnam War, in which we were fighting a war against insurgents, in which our great military technology seemed to be of no use to us. Sounds familiar? And then there was an energy crisis at that time created by an oil embargo from the OPEC oil cartel to sort of show us their power. Combine all of that together, and we went into a recession, and sort of bopped around in that recession for quite some time. Some people refer to that period as stagflation, because we had inflation and a sort of a stagnant economy that didn't seem to be going anywhere. Okay, so I wanted Farrar, Straus and Giroux, which was my employer, to make money, right? And enough with these eclectic authors that Giroux would be hiring, and not hiring, but would be giving the opportunity to publish their works at Farrar, Straus and Giroux. And you know, it's very hard to get book data, so I did what most people do. We use Amazon.com to get a track of how books are sold. And the reason that's a good thing is because they sell about 150,000 books a day, which is pretty impressive. But of course they're one bookseller, so it's a bit biased. But I wanted to show you which is where I got the idea for this talk, this particular graph. I was told not to show graphs, but I think this is a much more sophisticated audience than usual, so I hope you'll put it with my bivariate plot. And Amazon.com ranks books. They actually have a #1 book, and a #1 book would be a book that would be selling almost 3,000 copies a day. But it plummets dramatically. By the time that you are ranked number 10, you're selling a mere 500. Now, I can tell you my volume, I'd be lucky if we sold just a few, you know, it's an academic volume, a few copies. We're probably, I don't dare to look up the rank of my edited volume. It's down here someplace, I'm sure. But see, Giroux was really pushing for authors in this sort of area. And I wanted the company to make money so we would get out of the wage price freeze that had been invoked by our beloved president back then. And I thought, why don't we go for these bestsellers? Well, let me show you, at least currently, you know, what sort of books they would be. So here's the current list. Unfortunately, I made this last week. Kind of distressing, actually, to see how fast it changes. But I thought if we could get these sorts of books, like Obama's 2 books, you may notice, not surprisingly, are in the top ranked here. So that's selling quite a bit. The second book last week was IOUSA by Wiggin and Contrera and Walker. It says it's a lively and entertaining romp through the 4 deficits the nation faces: the budget deficit, the personal savings deficit, the trade deficit, and leadership deficit. And Okay, then there's The Shack, which is called Another God Meets Guy book. You can read about what that is. And much to my surprise, these 4 books are all by Stephanie Meyer. They're the Twilight series. I really like how they describe this. Great love stories thrive on sacrifice. Throughout the Twilight saga, which is a series of books Stephanie Meyer is writing, she has tried to emulate these great love stories. This is from Publishers Weekly. Romeo and Juliet, Wuthering Heights. Okay? But in this case, it is the fated yet perpetually doomed love of Bella, the human girl, and Edward, the vampire. Okay? It is remarkable that all 4 of these books, sadly this morning, I just showed my prejudice. Actually, interestingly, this morning I discovered that these 4 books are now in the top, and the Obama books have sank down. So I thought I would look at Romeo and Juliet. There are many different editions out. This was the best-selling one, which is ranked at number 6,700. And you see it's very hard to actually see how many books that's actually selling. And then if we look at Wuthering Heights, again, the best issue of the Wuthering Heights that's selling, or the highest rank, it's ranked number 15,286. And I think my volume on biodiversity and ecosystem functioning probably has an even lower one. We can look at the New York Times, and it's still sort of interesting in that, they had last week Nelson DeMille's The Great House, which I won't go into in too much detail. It says that the plot more than takes its time getting to its violent and predictable resolution, but DeMille devotees should have plenty of fun along the way. Dewey is about a cat that was stuffed into, I think, the mailbox of a library in Iowa, and the librarians adopted it, and it's all about how we can learn from Dewey, the pussy cat. And so then I decided to take, these were the books that Giroux was interested in. The ones that would win the Nobel Prizes, the ones that would win the Pulitzers, and the ones that would win the National Academy. There's my mind. Which win the National Book Awards, and so I won't bother going into those details. But I thought we are never going to make it if we don't get the books about the pussycats. Of course, I would mature from then. I think what I noticed then, as I do now, is actually abstractly this particular curve. It's the log normal curve. So here I'm showing you a bunch of curves, and it's something that I think dominates science. It's a very, very interesting phenomenon, as much as it is for ecologists, as it is to economists, social scientists, and physicists, and chemists, and engineers. This is the normal distribution, in which you have some sort of average, and then you have some things which are above the average and some things which are below. So there might be a mean height, and there's some very tall people and some very short people. But in fact, most of the world doesn't really seem to be represented by this sort of normal distribution. It's represented more by something called the log normal distribution, where it's always skewed, where there always seems to be some number of things which have a value, and many, many things which have values lower than that. In fact, this very strongly skewed thing here reflects, I think, what we saw in the typical book sale figures. There are a few books which are very, very common, and then there are a mess of books which are very, very rare. And I always remembered that sort of that idea about commonness and rarity once I became an ecologist, back to my days in the 70s when I was in the book business. Because this sort of idea comes to you when you wander around the world, as I started to do more and more. Now, these are just, if you were to take a walk with me in New York, near Black Rock Forest, for example, you would see these creatures I'm sure you recognize quite readily. And if you look closely, as I do, you'd see lots of different species down on the ground that might not catch your attention unless you looked closely. But as you walk more and more and start travel to other countries, maybe get out of New York, which I know is a rare thing to do for many of us, go to Minnesota, which is where I actually had my first professorial position, the same place where Norman Borlaug actually, he was in the building next to us, and started to see a new set of species that were there. This was a day that dragonflies had emerged. I'd been there for 7 years and hadn't seen that. I'm now working in Inner Mongolia on the grasslands in China along with my students, and saw a Siberian iris wandering through Texas, the Dominican Republic. I was only in the Dominican Republic for about a week and saw an extraordinary number of species for such a tiny island state. And the sense I got as I was wandering around is that the more you explore, the more species you will see. And that might seem somewhat trivial at first, but it did make me realize that if you don't have a chance to get out and explore, you will not actually get an appreciation for the diversity of life that is out there. And I became more and more interested, although as a cell biology major, as an undergraduate at UC Berkeley, in this phenomenon of the great diversity of life that was out there, which I found studying the molecular biology of the cell was less and less satisfying for. Some beautiful little sort of microfungi in Costa Rica, and these perennially cute little frogs, many of which are imperiled. Here's a mama duck and her babies in New Zealand. And some of these species might be familiar to you. They might resonate with you. You might feel like, there's my child going off to college. And then, the snake might strike fear in your heart. This is a hornbill that's actually feeding its mate that was living inside that tree. And then this was when I was in Chile, and I just thought this creature has the ideal life, if you ask me. And you can see it on its smug little face. The interesting thing about this, actually, in an abstract way, is something that's called the species area curve or the species area relationship. It's got a very simple equation. I thought, people said don't put equations up, but I thought we could put up with this one since it's so phenomenon. And what it says is so simple, it's so easy to follow. What it says is that the number of species is basically a function of some constant here, and the area in which you've done your exploration to find those species, and then raised to the power, this power law, which is a constant. And it turns out that whether you're looking at plants or microbes, whether you're looking at insects or mammals, no matter what you're looking at, very, very often it comes to about 0.25. And there's no reason for that to be the case. And this puzzle has actually has possessed ecologists for a long time because it suggests that nature is not randomly structured. It actually has almost a universal law to it because this kind of relationship is something you see in many, many other fields as well. So if we were to look at the Earth and imagine that the number of species was about 30 million, my favorite estimate for the total number of species, and say that the area that you could explore was 510 million square kilometers. If you don't leave your house, that's pretty easy, you won't see any species. But if you get out even just a little, you'll see a lot. But it does take a tremendous amount of effort for you to go and see all of those species that are out there. And to tell you the truth, we only have about 2 million which have actually been formally described by scientists, and a smaller number, millions more, that might be known but not formally described. I want to give you an example just to convince you that this is in fact a very active area of research. This is in 2000 by Plotkin et al. And here they're looking at the distribution and abundance of trees inside 5 different tropical rainforests all across the world. And I'm going to show you another graph. You can ignore this one on the bottom here, but as you can see from their publication, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, that as they increased the area of investigation for the forest they were looking at, they found that the number of species of trees they encountered went up, and then it leveled off. Now, you notice that their curves are at different heights, but they all have the same shape. That's that C equals approximately 0.25. Now, I want to go back and show you the extraordinary effort this took. We're looking here at 235,000 tree species made up of 305 made up of 305 species. Here, 17,000 trees made up of 68 species. Here we have 339,000 trees made up of 1,171 species. This is not easy data to get, but it's incredibly valuable because it tests the idea about whether nature is random or it's not. And it's not random. It's very, very highly structured. And I became fascinated by that, as many ecologists have. In fact, the broken stick model by MacArthur, one of the more well-known ecologists back in the 70s, the log normal by Preston in the 1950s, Robert Fisher's alpha. He was the famous Sir Fisher, a statistician who came up with a way of describing this. And here we have these youngsters, Plotkin et al. Actually, I don't know if they're young or not, but they're new contributors to the field, and they claim that they have an even better model because you see their model is the yellow line, and the data go through that yellow line much better than these other. Seems like every few years we get a new theory, and I think if you want to be very successful in ecology, you have to address this question: why is nature so non-random? So Frank Preston in 1948 was the first to actually sort of give us a formal explanation for why that occurred. I won't go into that in too much detail. There isn't time here, but be happy to talk to you if you want to come by any day and talk about why people think this occurs. But you can see that just like the books I was talking about, there are a number of species here which have very, very low densities whenever you go out and sample them. So here, looking at the species that they found in a particular set of moths, I believe, yes, these are female moths picked up at a trap, there were numbers of species that had only one individual, numbers of species which had two. Some of the species had 8,192 individuals for a single species. And what you notice, you see the title of his paper, a very classic paper in ecology, is Commonness and Rarity of Species. He points out that nature is really defined by many, many species which are rare, just like many, many books which are not the best sellers out there, but nevertheless are quite important to our culture. There are many species out there as well, but the world is often dominated by a few species which seem to be fairly common. And there's no reason, there's absolutely no reason for that to be the case. So this log normal distribution is well worth exploring. As I said, if you look at it, some of you might say, well, I don't know, maybe it's just a sort of strange way about how the universe works. I'll give you some examples. The number of letters per word shows a log normal distribution. The number of words per sentence, the length of words and diversity of words follow log normal distributions. The age of marriage, farm size, and epidemiology, the latency of disease. I have a list of examples here that I'm reading from. The sizes of particles in a pile of sand, or the sizes of meteorites that hit our planet, they all show log normal distributions. I would argue that we should throw out the Gaussian distribution and start to think more about log normal distributions, because that's where the rare species and that's where the rare things start to matter. So to me, I think it was an interesting thing to start to, many, many years later as a graduate student in ecology, to discover what I had learned in the working world of publishing these commonalities about our knowledge base, our books, our literature, our nonfiction and fiction, and our species and how they were distributed. Now, Preston, interestingly, had noticed, as many scientists have, there are many articles about this, that the log normal distribution actually applies to many things, and here he's pointing out how it points to it actually explains some of the gas laws and what he calls wealth laws. And interestingly, he shows that if you look at the distribution of wealth, and here he's looking at wealth in 1926, I believe, he's showing that there's actually an extraordinarily small number of people who make an awful lot of money, and then there's an awful lot a number of people who make very, very little money. And he argued that that's actually pretty much the same sort of distribution for energy that you see in particles in an ideal gas. And then he goes on to say that the log normal distribution, as I just said, is something that seems quite common throughout the universe. What's interesting, he ends his article almost suggesting that we shouldn't buck against this, that maybe the natural order of things is to have a few people with lots of money and many, many people. I can't believe he said that, but I imagine that since he published out of a laboratory which was called the Frank W. Preston Laboratories, he may have been one of those people in the other end of that. This appeared in the Atlantic Monthly, and once again, my life seems possessed by these log normal distributions. I said, wow, take a look at that. And this was a way of actually trying to illustrate that in a more graphic way. And the idea is, imagine that there's a parade of people, and that the people's height is actually represented by the proportion of wealth that they actually own. So if we were to start at this end of the parade here, of course this would be the end of the parade, this would be the 99.995th percentile. The individual would be 933 feet tall. So we're just seeing the shoe here. And the individual goes way up there someplace, well above the campus. And then as soon as you get to the 99.95th percentile, we drop down to a very short 181 feet. And then when you get down to the 97th percentile, we get down to the 21-foot person. And if you actually look at the entire parade, this is what the parade would look like. So actually we'd start out here, and as the author points out, at the beginning of the parade you wouldn't see anybody because they'd actually be underground. Their heads would be below the ground because they actually owe people money, or they're being subsidized in one way or another. And then we have all of these people. It'd be a long, long, long parade, and then you'd get to the end and boom, all the wealthy people would go by very, very quickly. And this is, as you can see, a beautiful, beautiful log normal distribution. And of course, and this came up a lot during the recent election debates about who we would tax, what's the base, and so forth. And of course, in our country, I think we recognize that everybody here plays a role, but this wealth distribution is something that we're quite familiar with. The article argues, however, that the wealth distribution is much more skewed than you would expect, and I'll leave you to read that article to learn more about that. My main point is that you can see that it fits a lot of things that we know about the world. So I now want to talk about just a couple of examples, because there isn't very much time about the science that I do, but I wanted to start out by acknowledging, in case I forget, that I'm a chair. I don't really do very much. I sort of write the grants and try to stimulate people to write papers and go out and get grants and fellowships and things like that. And so, really, it's my lab. And this is my lab here. We are enforcing the laws of nature wherever we can. I think that if you talk to any scientist, they recognize that their life is really defined by the postdocs and the students that surround them, graduate and undergraduate as well. And we have a lot of fun, in spite of the fact that the subject that we're tackling can be, in some views, quite grim. You may have noticed in the introductions by Lee and Alan that there was a lot of sort of, boy, we're tackling this really grim thing, the death of life as we know it, and so forth. And so I actually haven't said anything about that. In fact, I seem somewhat happy, don't I? I've been determined to take to find a way to put a sort of a humorous spin on the demise of our world as we know it. And I think, and I'll explain why that is if I can get to everything I'd like to talk to you at the very end as to why I take that tactic. But the very first paper I did, this was back when I was a postdoc in England, and we worked on this machine called the Ecotron, and we knew the power of naming something like that. And this is an ordinary person. She is not one of the wealthiest people who is 930 feet tall. She's an ordinary person, and she's measuring here light inside the vegetation at different heights. This is a community that we built of many different species, and then we built a variety of other communities which had fewer and fewer species in them. So every time you moved to a different chamber in the Ecotron, there were 16 chambers, you would find that there were smaller numbers of species. And we actually asked the question, what would happen if you were to lose biodiversity? And believe it or not, in 1994, that was the first time that anybody had ever asked that question. Trust postdocs who don't know any better to say, gosh, nobody's asked that question, why don't we try it out? And there were about 10 of us who worked on the project, and 5 of us authored the paper that came out in Nature. And much to our surprise, it became the 5th most cited paper in global change research shortly after its publication. We all got jobs, so we did the right thing, which is important. I hate to be mercenary about it. But we were surprised, I think, because we thought, well, of course, wouldn't you expect that the more diversity you have, the better an ecosystem would be? The more carbon it would store, the more toxins it would detoxify, the more pollutants it would degrade, the more stable it would be. It just seemed like, the goodness of species was something one wouldn't question. And yet, we were surprised when I went to see why, it had become one of the most widely cited papers. You never want to do that, because you'll find out that about half of the citations were this, what an other bit of rubbish this was. But my professor, told me, he said that you always want to work on something that's controversial. That's where the excitement is. Don't work on something that's boring. And boy, did we step into something that turned out to be fairly controversial. So we, to quiet things down, we put out a stultifying academic symposium volume, which I think is still being published. I don't know its academic rank. And we have another one that should be coming out next year, which is going to try to quiet the masses about this. And yet all we wanted to say in that volume, authored by many, many people, all of them who've been very successful now as ecologists, and in fact one of my student who I co-authored a paper with, not my student, just got a job at Stanford, which was the job I was denied when I had interviewed back, I don't know, a long, long time ago. That person got tenure and left, so I thought, oh, my job has opened up again. But of course, I'm senior now. And then I found out that my student I co-authored a paper with got that job. So this is a very active field, and it's a lot of fun. I don't have time to go into the research in great detail, and you'd probably get sleepy if I did, but I did want to show you a paper that actually came out of Columbia by Dan Bunker here and Fabrice de Klerk. Fabrice is an Earth Institute fellow. They're wonderful people who are brought here by the Earth Institute to help sort of mix things up at the university. And Dan Bunker is now, he was my postdoc. Alas, he is now an assistant professor at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. I say alas because it's so useful having postdocs around. They do grow up after a while. And he did this remarkable work where we gathered as much data as we could, or I should say they did, for a patch of tropical rainforest and asked questions about how much carbon could that forest store. And the conclusion we came with is that the answer to that very, very important question, in an age of climate warming because of all that CO2 that's in the atmosphere, and we want to know how much carbon can be stored in that forest, was very, very dependent on the number of species and the kind of species that was in there. Not only was the quantity of carbon that could be stored important in terms of the diversity of the forest, but also the sort of reliability of that forest for storing your carbon. So you might imagine that if you have money that you want to put into a bank, which right now you might be hesitant to do, but if you did, you would want to find a bank that was going to be there for a long time, was going to give you sort of reliable storage of your accounts. And if we wanted to use forests to be our banks for storing carbon, you would want to get one that actually does not only a good job, but also does a stable job of it. And that's what our argument was here. This rapidly became another very widely cited paper because it brought biodiversity into the carbon market. I just wanted to show you this because, molecular biologists always throw out their three-dimensional graphs that rotate. And it would take a long time to explain to this. I think you're just supposed to be impressed that we can do this as ecologists as well. Okay? So what I would do is I would say, if you have any questions, ask me afterwards. But primarily what my lab did was, I put the challenge before them to try to come up with a new way of quantifying diversity. And we came up with a relatively obtuse term for it. And we came up with a way of defining diversity in a way that would actually track its value in terms of what it does for us in terms of things like storing carbon or detoxifying toxins or degrading pollutants. And now I want to show you the study we've done most recently. It's still in manuscript form, so please don't rush out and try to publish it. Brenda Lynn, who is the postdoc who led this, and my entire lab was involved in it. This is a set of Prairie Stamps put out by the government. I worked in the Prairie in Minnesota for a long time, right next to Norman Borlaug, who worked into turning the Prairie into cornfields. And we had a chance to sit back and ask questions about what would happen to our world. Here's the challenge that we sort of faced. This is the American Great Plains, one of the most beautiful places in the world, at least back when it looked like this, in my opinion. And you can still find places where there are a few bison roaming until they hit a fence. And if you were to explore the grasslands there, you would probably find that it has this extraordinary sort of diversity of plants and animals. There are cultural and aesthetic and other sorts of reasons for valuing that, but I wanted to take, as we did in our lab, a more sort of practical view. What are the consequences of taking this and turning it into this, where we still have grazing animals, albeit cattle, and we still have grasses. There aren't herds of bison. Actually, we sort of cut it all up and then we feed them in feedlots. That's how we manage it these days. And now there's only 1% of the prairies left. Isn't that amazing? We're always worried about the disappearance of the rainforest. We're always worried about disappearance of other habitats in other countries. Yet here in our own country, our most beautiful habitat, the American prairie, only 1% of it is left. And it's all been turned into this, which, my spouse, who's from Wisconsin, was really disappointed when I was traveling through Wisconsin and really had nothing poetic to say about this, this habitat. Because if you grow up in this landscape, it's actually, in your own eyes, a beautiful landscape and says something about the strength of our species and its ability to wrestle from the earth the resources we need to make a good living. And the question that we had is sort of phrased by this sort of abstract picture here. We wanted to know if the capacity of our agricultural landscape, which replaced the prairie, is actually less than the capacity that used to be there. Is that a contraction? So the green here would represent our native hull, as it's called. I'll explain why that is if you want later. But you can get the sense that the alternative, and many people might feel this is true, is that the agricultural landscape is actually much more useful and diverse and powerful as an ecological system because soybean, corn, wheat, and cattle are much more resilient and robust species than the pathetic bison and prairie grasses that used to be there. The other possibility is they're both the same, they've just been displaced. A little bit, so I want to shift. And another is that we may have such a displacement that they're two completely different worlds. And I want to show you what the analysis was, and I think it's really a shocking result. And also beautiful in its own way. Here's our nice three-dimensional rotating graph. I think you can sort of get a sense here that this represents the American prairie and the Great Plains that used to be there and the ecological capacity. What that means is that if there was a drought, if there was a fire, if there was a wet time or a flood, this kind of grassland here was very, very robust and very, very likely to show some ability to survive under those changing conditions. This is our agricultural system. Not only does it have very, very little capacity to adapt to those sorts of changes, it's also a completely different world. This is the brave new world that we live in, and it's a question we might ask about whether or not this is something that makes you comfortable or makes you worried. So now let's catch us up to where we are today. So this probably looks familiar to everybody, even if you didn't pay attention to the Dow Jones before. You now see it on the news all the time, and it's sort of interesting now to be up here above 10,000, right? And actually to say, back in the 70s when we were below 1,000, and to watch, dropping from a very, very high to a low value is something that worries us. People are not quite sure where it's going to bottom out, and we're concerned. We're getting memos from the president and from the vice president about how we should tighten our belts here at the university, and we've been there before. My father-in-law is in the audience and has been through the Depression, and he'll tell you, we survived, and you just had to tighten your belt. It's a message he continues to deliver to us, and I think maybe we'll heed him a bit more now than we have living in New York. And I wanted to show you what is happening now since 1970, and this is where it might get sort of depressing. This is the Living Planet Index. This report came out just a couple of weeks ago. It's the 2008 Living Planet Report, and it tells you the state of biodiversity if you believe their index. Their index is based on about 5,000 populations of vertebrates mostly, and it collects the information on how they are trending. Are they trending down or are they trending up? And there's probably about 1,800, I think, species that are in the entire set. I don't have the numbers before me, but it's roughly in that sort of category. And the idea is that if we keep track of fish and birds, that's about 1,600 species of mammals and birds and reptiles. So there are no insects or anything like that in here. But you can see that, in 1970, we're not sure if things were getting better because we were actually setting up more parks or conservation biology was growing, or whether we're just getting more and more data about more species out there. But it's clear that right here, as we got into the 1990s, that things started to go downward and started to go downward at an alarming rate. And if you look at these two other indices, one which is called the Ecological Footprint and the other which is called World Biocapacity, the ecological footprint sort of tells you how much it is we need to consume. What are the resources that each individual would need? In this case, we're actually asking about the entire human population. And they're saying here that if you consider that the world was able to provide those needs and we standardized that to one, that somewhere in the mid-1980s, back at the height of yuppiedom, we wound up crossing that, where we are now needing, about 1.4 planets to supply what is currently consumed or needed by our population. So when the press release for this Living Planet report was the real credit crunch, and the credit crunch we really have to worry about, which I thought was a nice way of trying to capture this study so the press to understand. And here it is again. I thought, wow, look at that. There's another log normal distribution. Don't you love log normal distributions? I think I'm going to start a collection of them. This is the biocapacity, and of course you can see, you might try to guess where we are. This is telling us in a single acre of land that an individual might live, how much support are they going to find. So the units here, it's cut off a little bit at the top there, but it tells you what the biocapacity is available per person, and it's measured in hectares. So if you're a person in Gabon, your country has a tremendous amount of biocapacity. However, if you go down this list here, Canada has a lot of biocapacity, has a capacity of supporting each of its individuals very, very well. When you get down to the United States, we're still above this line here, but you'll notice that the bar is red and gets increasingly red if the reason your biocapacity is actually high is because it's being subsidized. So we're actually importing food from a lot of other countries. So our biocapacity is actually sort of inflated by the fact that we import a lot of our resources. And if you look at the ecological footprint, you'll see that in contrast, We are right up there with the United Arab Emirates in terms of the number of hectares it takes in the world to support a single individual. There's that line where we would like not to cross, and you can see, I don't know if that's something, I guess, go America, go. Once again, we top the world in exceeding the biocapacity of our own home country. It's interesting to take a look at these because if you contrast that with the fact that we looked at a log normal distribution for species, and most of our species are rare, yet they're very important to the way our ecosystems work, which is the studies I showed you. And you look at wealth distribution, and now you look at these ecological distributions in terms of footprint and biocapacity. It gives you a picture of the way our world looks today. And this one here is broken down by sort of large geographic regions, which shows you that there are still some regions of the world where the biocapacity hasn't been exceeded. But there are other places where it has. And it's interesting to think about, if we are trying to pursue this new path of sustainable development, how we might take into consideration biocapacity and ecological footprint into those deliberations and try to do that. Okay, so we get back to these little creatures, big and small. To me, it seems that when we are going out and looking at biocapacity, when we're going out and looking at ecological footprint, we forget about what our studies are increasingly showing, that these species, which we have some sort of cultural value for, there are lots of reasons we might want to conserve them independent of what they do in terms of those ecosystem services they provide us. I enjoy going out just to see them. But I also look at them and I say, these are the workers. They're the little ones in that long parade that are working 24/7 for us to make our planet livable. And yet no one is particularly taking them into our considerations about how we're going to try to deal with the rapid changes we're seeing in our world. Isn't that cute? You don't really want to curl up with them. But these are all pictures that again, that I have taken as I've wandered the world, mostly because I find them fascinating, but also because I'm amazed at the diversity of life that's out there that creates that biocapacity that tells us whether or not we're going to be able to stay in balance. And so then you travel, and this was where I was in the summer, and I came back exhausted, and I got that strange email on September 5th that made me think about all this. Because when I was and the Craigs, I think, are going to see the same sort of experience. Here we are in Kenya at a Millennium Village. That's one of the Earth Institute's Millennium Villages, where they're trying to see if they can find a way to take the idea or the theory of sustainable development and try to achieve poverty alleviation. And I, as an ecologist, am trying to bring the science of ecology into those sorts of activities. I have to confess, it's quite a challenge. You see these people, and they remind us of ourselves. They're they're full of energy. They're full of enthusiasm. They're full of ideas, and they're struggling. And yet, when I go around, I'm not quite sure how exactly we can begin to take our science, only because we've just started. It's a little late to start this, and try to get them out of the poverty trap that they've been stuck in. Here's a Columbia undergraduate helping them devise a healthcare system, kind of like our other Columbia graduate who's been doing that in the nation right now. And this is Pedro Sanchez, who is winner of the World Food Prize and the MacArthur Genius Award. And the Norman Borlaug had set that up a long, long time ago, and it was a pleasure to meet. I have endless discussions with him. I have to say we argue quite a bit, but we agree on many things as well. And this is the farmer of that area who came out to greet him, and I stood back and watched as these people gathered on the hill to listen to the translator translate the conversation between the farmer and Pedro, who's asking questions about the wisdom of growing cotton. The farmer thinks it's a very bad idea, why they're growing the crops they grow, the sort of tillage practices they take. And there's a PhD, a master's, and an undergraduate, all from Columbia, and I'm back there holding the camera, and there's Cheryl Palm. I think that Columbia, as is not atypical, is taking the lead in trying to take the science that we do, social and natural science, and try to bring it to some real-world problem solving. And ecologists have a bit of sort of catch-up to do. Now, one thing I might say, as long as we're talking about Columbia, to return back to the publishing world and our participation, is that I told Alan probably thought I was just trying to flatter him, but it's actually my job as a chair to actually lock horns with him whenever possible. It says that in the handbook, actually. And but I read this. I was reading a long series of very, very short articles about the future of the American idea. And there, I just want to read it to you. It says, there may be room to redefine how we exercise leadership. that we could embrace elements of the American idea that have in the past and might again make the United States not just a feared military power, but an exemplar of ideals of potentially universal appeal. As human rights, environmental responsibility, and a commitment to peace and stability as a precondition of progress and indeed survival. It was right there, of course, environmental responsibility mixed in with human rights and a commitment to peace and stability, which I think defines the School of International and Public Affairs, the Earth Institute, our department, the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences, so many different factions. I have to say, when I came here and people said, did I want to join a department that had 2 faculty in it and leave a department that had an entire building at Seattle, when I wandered around and met the people here and at Lamont and also in the American Museum and the New York Botanical Garden and the Wildlife Conservation Society, I realized this was the happening place. We're really the sort of startup for this new sort of view. And I think that we have at the root of the American people a genuine fondness for our habitats, as witnessed in these postal stamps that come out every year. There's the Prairie Stamps. I always, you can also see how the postal rates keep rising. But I love to see these when they come out. There aren't people in here, but they do show that I think America does have a great appreciation for all the species that are out there. And what we'll do if we decide that we will become the environmental, the leader for environmental stewardship as our new national identity, which I think we should do, because that will be the biggest crisis our planet faces, is the environmental crunch, the real credit crunch, as the Living Planet report says. Right now, so what are we going to do? People always say, never say what it is I think we should do. I think this is what we should do. Right now, we have these sorts of websites that can tell you about the birds and about the tree of life and about the diptera. So if you want to go find out about flies. And then if you want to find about the South American cichlids or this new thing, which E.O. Wilson has helped spearhead, I think there's something like $10 million from the MacArthur Foundation and $2 million from the Sloan Foundation to make a web page for every single species to describe. We got an NSF grant to actually do a more scientific venture. It's only about $500,000, which is not enough, but we want to build a prototype of a new kind of computer service called TraitBank, modeled after GenBank. I won't go into the details, but we're very excited about this. We had our first meeting here in December last year, and we were overwhelmed by what it is we want to do. To give you a sense of what it is we want to do, take out your iPhone, and you might imagine that if you look closely down on it, that there would be an app, as they are called, that you would download called Biodiversity. And that if you clicked on that app, that it would actually, locate where you are with the GPS unit. And then you could actually, if you didn't want to, I think it wouldn't be too interesting looking at biodiversity in Manhattan. We do have a red-tailed hawk that lives outside of our apartment. But, we might scoot down, and I'm only going to do this because I have a number of photos. And I know you can do this. I have webcams at my bird feeders in our house near Black Rock Forest. And I can actually, you can't see it now because it's dark, I actually look at the birds at my bird feeder on my iPhone. So I know you can do this if you just get enough resources to make it happen. So here we are zooming in the Dominican Republic because I was there and I have lots of photos of it. And then we can, turn it into its natural habitat. And then after that, we would be able to say we want to look for the spiders because we've come across a spider. We're curious about the spider diversity that's there. I happen to have lots of pictures of spiders. There are lots of spiders in the Dominican Republic. Otherwise, I would have done something else. And then you would further click, and then if you really cared about it, which I don't, you could get the systematics in great detail already. But then I think you'd really want to know more about, what's their trophic level, what do they feed on, how many species there are, what the population, what the biomass of the individual is, so we could actually figure out what those things in the tail of the distribution are doing for the environment of the Dominican Republic. And then, if you went, you could go and get the Dow Jones if you wanted to, but you could also get the latest readings for the biocapacity and the ecological footprint for that country. And you could also get the net primary productivity. And it seems like this is sort of a fantasy world, but yet, if you think about it, and if you know the sciences I and my students and postdocs and colleagues know, we think it's just a matter of a few years before we might actually be able to do that. I think that, we really should, at the end of the news broadcast, find out not just what the Dow Jones is, but also what the latest status on biocapacity and ecological footprint are. So there's a lot to do. It should be a lot of fun as well. And the technology and the resources, I think, are there. So you may wonder why it is that I just wanted to show you these shy deer and this dove that's returning. This is in Colorado here, my favorite trees, the bristlecone pine with their roots bound to the slopes there. They're some of the oldest creatures on the world. The dolphins, these are people in Australia who actually paid money just to have the dolphins come up to them and take fish from their hand. And we thought it was so much fun. Sarah and I went and paid money to do it as well. And it was really a lot of fun. So I want to read this poem to you, which unfortunately is in very tiny print. But just to explain as my last comment why it is I don't feel that we should take a look at this in any other way than a positive way, that we can do something about the changes in our planet. So this is a poem called Advice to a Prophet by Graves. I'm not a prophet, but by any means, but he says that he's talking about, I think, sort of the environmental prophets of doom, and in this case it was the prophets of nuclear annihilation, which I think was far just as serious back in a long time ago. But he says, I'm just going to read it to you. Mad-eyed from stating the obvious, not proclaiming our fall, but begging us in God's name to have self-pity. Spare us all word of the weapons, their force and range, the long numbers that rocket the mind. Our slow, unreckoning hearts will be left behind, unable to fear what is too strange. I don't really see that there is much to be gained by starting out with the number of species that are going extinct, the change in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the receding shorelines, the emerging diseases. Although I said I don't really see the point in doing that, I see that I'm now actually listing all the terrible reasons why you should not go to sleep tonight. But it says, that you shall not scare, nor shall you scare us with talk of the death of the race. How should we dream of this place without us, right? The sun, mere fire, the leaves untroubled about us, a stone look on a stone's face. Speak of the world's own change. Though we cannot conceive of an undreamt thing, we know to our cost how the dreamt cloud crumbles, how the vines are blackened by frost, and it goes on to say that we could believe, if you told us so, that the white-tailed deer will slip into perfect shade, grown perfectly shy, the lark avoid the reaches of our eye, the jack pine lose its knuckled grip on the cold ledge, and every torrent burn as xanthus once, its gliding strouts stunned in a twinkling. What should we be without the dolphin's ark, the dove's return, these things in which we have seen ourselves and spoken? The poem goes on. That's why I think that if you look at nature and you have a sense of how rich it is, and you understand that although these species are rare, they are as important as we are. I think none of us are actually, we're all in that long part of the parade of humanity. These are in the long parade of our natural ecosystems. I think that, to imagine that these things are not going to be there one day is certainly something that can get us all tragic and, teary-eyed and worried about it. Certainly I get choked up when I think that if I were to walk next year and the year after that, the planet is getting increasingly lonelier. And I feel that, actually, because you have to walk longer and harder to find those species. But more importantly, I recognize that if we lose our friends and our companions in this world who are working with us to make the world a better place, and mind you, they don't belong to any unions, they don't have any health benefit plans, that nevertheless all of us have exactly the same sorts of goals, which is to make the world a better place for us to live in, then there is a reason to look at biodiversity with a tremendous amount of a sense of purpose and of optimism about what we can do. I think our department, one of the reasons I like, although our department is a struggle, going into our department and seeing all the young people there, is that their attitude about it is that something can be done, and the world is changing, in spite of what our generations have done to it in the past. And they are doggedly determined, in spite of the fact that we have among the largest numbers of credits required to anybody, and we are second to chemistry in terms of how hard we ding them on their GPA, they still come to us. And we have about 40 brave souls who have majored in our department and are going to go out and make the world a better place, as will all of you. So thank you very much for indulging my eclectic thoughts. I've probably run way over, but I have one last thing to do. No, Alan, it belongs to you. So I said it was my duty as the chair, because it says in the handbook that you must always argue with the provost. I want resources for my department and for my students. And, you know, and Alan has to dole them out with all the other departments who come asking for the same thing. But I had to recognize when I saw that Alan had decided he was going to go on to do other things and not be provost anymore, that at least during his tenure, our program has really flourished. We have 10 faculty. We keep about 1,000 students per semester. I have all students come over to my house for dinner, undergraduates, masters, PhDs, and soon postdocs. And I can't fit them all because we have over 100 students. So we only have 12 of these hats and jackets, which is the ecology with no apology. And I decided if my lab I didn't ask their permission, I should have, that I would give one of the last remaining ones because I think Alan has really been a champion for ecology in our university. So I did want to take the opportunity. Unfortunately, it's only an extra large, but I think that way you'll look like, you know, P. Diddy if you put it on. So thanks for being a great provost.
Thank you, Shahid, and I'm happy to take the credit for things I had very little to do with, but it's really been a pleasure listening to you tonight, and I'm sure that members of the audience will have questions if you're willing.
Sure. How are we doing on time, though? I haven't.
We have time.
Okay.
And there will be a reception afterwards. Where? Here? We'll find room. But
So are there any questions?
Like so many things that are important to our world, like air and water and those kinds of things that are not monetized, is there any idea of, preserving species by rewarding people for doing so in some sort of monetary way? Is that ever crossed any?
So I think our department, actually, one of its majors, and many of the students are specializing in conservation biology. The question was there any sort of way of monetizing, or I would say incentivizing people for saving species? And we realized a long time ago that building sort of a fortress around a park to keep people out actually just led to the continuing deterioration of the park. We needed to incentivize the process. In some cases, it's not so much giving them money, maybe it's just actually trying to convince them that there are clear benefits by them protecting the area rather than saying stay out. My student, Man Banger, just started actually really looking at, say, the relationship between protected areas, open areas, and areas which the community is actually working to save the area and actually can extract resources that they need from that. She'll be doing this work in India starting probably this summer. And we will try to find ways to work to incentivize it. Maybe not all of it with money, but it is an idea that dominates thinking, especially in modern conservation biology. Way back there.
One of my favorite quotes from Albert Einstein is, nothing will more greatly ensure the survival of the human race than the adoption of a vegetarian diet. That's a quote from Albert Einstein. And I'd like to comment on how perhaps government, societies, institutions encouraging a return to a plant-based diet, how that might affect biocapacity for nations or hemispheres.
Okay. So the question is about the role of vegetarianism and what you could do for biocapacity. And it's a complex subject because laced into that, of course, are other sorts of ethical and moral issues as well, and also questions about the distribution of food and distribution of resources too. And we all know that if you eat meat, you're actually eating a tremendous amount of vegetables. On the other hand, if you look at many regions of the world, people where they have vegetation that's not edible, what they often do is put animals out there and eat animals. And grazing lands are a very, very large part of our world. And I don't know that they necessarily have the option unless we return those grazing lands into crop land. I'm not so sure it's a good idea. So the question is that a solution? Now, whether it's not a moral obligation is something I won't attempt to address. That's more philosophical. But I think it would be useful in terms of delaying, but as long as sustainable by the end of this day. We are omnivores, actually, evolutionarily speaking, not vegetarians. In a way, I think the question is more about taking a look at how we manage our resources, how we share them, the variability of how we do that, than it is about whether it's more or less. There's no question we did, we could lower the impact and perhaps be around for a few more generations. But we still ultimately have to answer that question. How do we achieve sustainable development?
Is there an effort to prioritize these areas of the world we have to be first to
That's an interesting question. So should we come up with a way of prioritizing the different ecosystems and habitats of the region? You know, the Conservation International, many people are developing what's called biodiversity hotspots. Regions of the world which, for their size, actually contain a tremendous number of species. And I'm all for that, but that's separate from what we've been talking about here today, which is the value of species in terms of the roles they play in our environment. If you have a biodiversity hotspot that's very small and has lots of species in it, they're not playing much role other than to make us feel happy that they haven't gone extinct. So I often tell people, I remind you of this big colony. Where is it? I think it's in Maryland or something like that, where these people dress up like the colonists and they churn butter and they spin wool and they do things like that. And they're there for our entertainment. They're not really producing any butter that we need in the world. They really don't have any role. And I think that if we were to build a fence around a biodiversity hotspot, that'd be great because the species we have very because we're protecting them. But what it is often is not really regulating rodent population. What the planet is not actually contributing to the regulation of greenhouse gases. What good is are all of those species in the system. They're not carrying out their role. What I think we should do is try to think about doing is how to maximize the utility of all these species in all regions, whether they're farmlands or whether they're urban areas and parks or wildlife, so that they can carry out the roles. They're very, very good at it. That answers this question. Prioritizing conservation areas is a complex subject.
just curious to what extent you translate the imperative to preserve biodiversity to
I mean, here at Columbia, you might be able to correlate our focus on environmental science with certain biases to the left. I don't know. I think that might be accurate. And if you look at the history of the U.S., we, as you showed in your data, we've sort of killed our plains, and there were some contrary voices to it while we were doing it, while we were spreading out agriculturally, using new farming methods, encouraging the use of the plow after World War I. So this is, as you said, eerily familiar to us. So do you find that the science that we now have describing biodiversity, different advocacy methods, allow us to, like I said, translate the importance of biodiversity to people that are really sort of facing the environment in a visceral way and trying to get more from it?
Well, I think if Brian Greene can explain two distinct theories, the book becomes a New York Times bestseller. And we as ecologists are looking at society to convince the people that there is something that's intrinsically interesting about it and also important. How to convey that message is a challenge. I often use the analogy of a machine, and I actually sometimes do it in real life. I've done it a few times where I bring in a computer and I ask people how much the computer is worth to them, and they give me a price, and then I start to dismantle it and say, how much is it worth to you now? It's a very good way to convey the value of parts in the system that you don't know how to function. You have the sense that when it starts to dismantle, it may function in ways that you're not going to be very happy about. That's a quick way to get the message across. As opposed to what we've done in the past, there's always been a tension between environmentalists and, I don't know what the opposite term might be, but let's say people who use authoritarian in terms of what we should do with nature. It goes everywhere from the religious dimension, the cultural dimension, the economic dimension. And I think that we now have at our fingertips enough data, enough understanding about how the world works, we can make the argument much more clearly that changing our habitat has consequences. Now, unfortunately, it took like a global scale change, like global warming, to actually make people realize that 6.7 billion people have the power to change something they thought was not really mutable, at least not by ourselves, because we once were a very small population. And I think if we could bring that message across to many other areas, like the fact that biodiversity reduces the spread of invasive species, or reduces the spread of emerging diseases, or can help stabilize the shores against the rising sea. Things like that, the message we get across now faster than ever before. What we lack, however, are the data. We spend so much time studying the evolution of species and not the functional roles. There's a lot of catching up to do. So I can go out and say, this is what we need to do in New York to make it a better place in terms of its park and diversity and its air. But I need to do a lot of work finding out the plants and the animals. We're working in China. We have a 5-year grant from NSF to look at their grasslands and how they are eroding because of the increasing number of sheep on the grasslands. And we've learned from our own experience here, where we created the Dust Bowl in the United States, we might be able to take our own experience and bring it there, ahead of their curve for erosion by hunting. But we're going to do this for 5 years to try to figure this out. That's a long time to get great. So if we can mobilize the forces and collect the data we need, I think we can solve the problem.
One is, most people are so worried about the financial collapse that's going on. Do you think that will encourage sort of a greater conservation that might be good for these types of efforts, or do you think that people need more luxury in order to be able to, support efforts for biodiversity or whatever, that the economic collapse is going to be a problem for environmentalists and for encouraging this type of ecological interest? And then the second question is, how frequently is sort of population control brought in to biodiversity or ecological studies? Or it seems that people talk about increasing numbers of the pressure that increasing population brings on the environment, but that population control is such a sort of politically charged subject that it's not really raised as a part of the problem.
Let me see if I can get to those. Those are two very, very complex and interesting questions. The first one was, with this credit crunch coming, how effective are we going to be at trying to convince people to push the conservation and environmental agendas forward? It's hard for me to say. I'm not a social scientist. I suppose I should ask Steve Cohen, because he has more experience about how we responded to things like clean air and clean water and garbage in New York. But my sense is actually that when environmental problems raise their head, people will address them independent of what the economic situation is. I think that if people got the convincing sense that the preservation of diversity in the United States was really important to their well-being, not necessarily their pocketbook, but to their well-being, you'd be surprised. I mean, I've been very impressed how in the United States the Endangered Species Act has survived some 35 years or something like that, through all kinds of administrations that I've seen. I mean, the public will not let go of this sense that it's important to save our species from going extinction. My question is, my purpose is a different one, which is not to keep them from going extinct, but to see that they can actually carry out their roles in our ecosystems. And I don't think that if we're down on our luck financially, that if somebody points to the need for preserving diversity to stop the spread of West Nile virus or Lyme disease, that people will actually react to that and perhaps shift their priorities about what they're funding and what they're not funding. Like $7.5 billion for a health care plan versus $700 billion to bail out the banks. You decide. Your second question was, quickly remind me, I've got distracted. Yes, population. Well, I'm not a demographer. I wish Joel Cohen was here. He told me he couldn't come tonight. And he'd be very quick to say that, population isn't something that one really tries to control, and I think it was a mistake in the early days to actually refer to it as if we needed to control population. Human population growth is a very complex thing that is tied into so many different sorts of feedbacks with resources, with education, with climate, with all kinds of things, with disease, with infant mortality, that in fact, my sense is that if you can get your environmental ducks in a row and you can get your education and health ducks in a row, you'll find that population probably will get in line as well. That's just, maybe that's overly optimistic, but at least there are a lot of data that suggests that population is certainly part of the problem, but it's not, it's not that the environment actually needs to be solved by controlling population. That in fact it's an integrated process of bringing our economies, an environment together into one working system. And I think you might find that population would start to show a change, as it already has, in a way that would work well with the environment. But I don't know. My spouse is a social scientist and a historian, and she always told me that as a historian of science not to worry when we were first courting one another, that until I die I'm not really of any interest to her. We've been married for a long time, and she has patiently taught me that scientists frequently make mistakes about making statements that really are in the realm, natural scientists, of the social scientists. You know, the sort of the managers, the economists, the sociologists, the psychologists, the anthropologists. So I have my ideas, but I know now to let the experts speak on that. I think what I liked about working with the Millennium Assessment was the first time we brought together 1,300 social and natural scientists from around the world to write the Millennium Assessment documents, which truly did take a clear look at population, economy, natural processes. And if you read their volumes, which are all available free on the web, you'll see that they don't really feel that population is the biggest thing we have to deal with. And I take them at their word as experts in social sciences that that's the case. But you're right, it's a politically charged issue. Right.
Can I ask?
One last question.
I'm bringing my bias from the field of education. I'm wondering if you have looked at the field of education as you are trying to reach out to as many segments of the population as possible, particularly at the secondary level, how well these ideas have been integrated, and what is the scope in the near future? Thank you.
I was going to show you a slide, but I don't think I have it now. And it was a education is, I think, that's why I got a university. And the center, we're associated with the Center for Environmental Research and Conservation. Its executive director is actually a specialist in science education. And we actually invest almost as much of our interest and research in science education K through 12 as we do at Columbia's level with undergraduate to graduate. The study I was going to show you was one that Andy Moffat had done at Oxford, and he had showed for children in the UK anyway, that there was, what he did is he took children of different ages in schools and handed them cards that asked them questions about the natural world around them and about Pokemon. Know what Pokemon. And so when they were very, very young, most of the children really did answer a lot of things about what a badger was, or a swan, or a mouse. The children had an intrinsic interest in the natural world around them. But as they got older, he showed that, and they're really eager to understand Pokemon, which is incredibly complex and really boring. It's kind of like my life. I find it very sort of complex. And he showed that at some stage, though, children, because of the commercial strategies for marketing these games, actually might be getting better at answering questions about Pokemon than they do about the natural world. He says that comes from the fact that children don't get out very much anymore. That's what's great to be in New York City. We have the American Museum, and the garden, and the zoo, and the park, and so forth. Here in the city, of all places, like you take your children out, so that they don't wind up being better at Pokemon than we are at the natural world. So we actually have a National Science Foundation K-12 grant that Louise Rose in come up and help to spearhead with Nancy Degnan and others. It's actually taking our graduate students who are getting degrees, national degrees in ecology, and embedding them in the K-12 system so that they actually experience with contributing a huge small as well as children to us as scientists. The interesting thing about Pokemon, you know, is that Pokemon was actually designed by a person who loved to collect bugs. And then one day they destroyed all the habitat where they collected bugs and thought how terrible for the children of Japan to not be able to have them fun and all the greatness of hunting bugs. So you make this game called Pokemon, in which you sort of go out and try to capture mythical little micro monsters, Pokemon, as we call it, Pokemon then. And the game became a huge hit. It was a $1 billion industry. It's the second class game that Nintendo had ever invented. And you got all these children in the spirit of collecting mythical beasts, right? Out there. So I think it's, you know, what that speaks to is that these video games actually, much as you may not like them, tell us that there's a tremendous amount of capacity for children to really understand the natural world if you can tap into the cellular video games. Fun. Yeah, that's the last question for the last time. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Shahid, for a wonderful talk.